Hello there. Welcome to this peaceful evening space we share together. Before we begin tonight's gentle journey into one of the most enchanting mysteries of medieval England, I want to check in with you. How are you feeling as this day draws to a close? Whether you're carrying the weight of modern worries, perhaps feeling a little disconnected from simpler times, or maybe just ready to let your mind wander back to when the world was quieter and mysteries felt more magical. All of these feelings are welcome here. Tonight, we're going to step back through the centuries to a time when the countryside was wilder, when strange happenings were whispered about by candlelight, and when two children appeared in a small English village, children whose very existence challenged everything the villagers thought they knew about the world. This is the story of the Green Children of Woolpit, a tale so gentle, so quietly impossible, that it has drifted through nearly 900 years of history like a half-remembered dream. Two children, green as summer leaves, who claimed to come from a land where the sun never fully rose, and who carried with them the memory of distant bells ringing in underground places. As we journey together through this extraordinary tale, you might notice your thoughts wandering to your own childhood, to times when the world felt more mysterious, when anything seemed possible. That's perfectly natural. If at any point your mind drifts away from our story, simply let it, and when you're ready, gently return to the medieval village of Woolpit, where something wonderful and impossible was about to emerge from the ancient wolf pits. Take a moment to settle into your space. Feel your body being supported, like sinking into soft grass on a warm summer afternoon in the English countryside. Let yourself relax completely, knowing that for the next 2 hours you can simply listen and let this gentle mystery carry you back to a time when the world was full of wonders we've since forgotten. Picture, if you will, a small village nestled in the gentle rolling hills of Suffolk, in the very heart of medieval England. The year is sometime in the 12th century, perhaps 1150, perhaps the year 1173. The exact date has been lost to the mists of time, but it doesn't matter now. What matters is the feeling of that place, that precious moment suspended in history, when the world was about to shift in the most gentle, most impossible way. Woolpit. The name itself carries an ancient story, first recorded in the 10th century as Woolpit and later as Wolfpeta. It derives from the Old English wolf pit, meaning pit for trapping wolves. These were deep holes that had been carefully dug around the village by generations of inhabitants, lined with sharpened stakes, designed to trap the wolves that once roamed these green Suffolk hills in great numbers, massive creatures with silver-grey coats and eyes like amber flame. But by the time our story begins, the wolves had long since vanished from this gentle countryside. The last of them hunted down and killed decades before, bears being hunted to extinction by the 11th century and beavers by the 12th. The ancient pits remained, overgrown now with blackberry brambles and wild roses, softened by time and weather, filled with fallen leaves from countless autumns, but still there, still waiting, as if they knew they would serve a different purpose, a more mysterious purpose than their makers ever intended. This was a time before electric lights pierced the velvet darkness, before the constant hum and buzz of modern life. The village of Woolpit existed in a world where night was truly dark, where the Milky Way stretched across the sky like a river of stars, where the only sounds after sunset were the gentle lowing of cattle in distant fields, the soft rustle of wind through wheat and barley, the hoot of owls calling from ancient oak trees, and the distant tolling of church bells marking the canonical hours, calling the faithful to prayer at dawn, at midday, at sunset. Each village was composed of a number of tofts, areas of 1/4 to 1 acre, rented from the lord. Each croft held the medieval house, typically 24 by 12 feet, 2 rooms, 5 or more people and not a lot else. The houses of Woolpit were built of timber and wattle and daub, their walls a warm honey colour, their steep thatched roofs golden as wheat fields. Smoke curled from their chimneys in thin blue ribbons, carrying the scent of burning wood and cooking porridge, of bread baking in clay ovens, of the simple, honest smells of life lived close to the earth. The villagers lived lives that followed rhythms as old as agriculture itself. They rose before dawn, when the eastern sky was just beginning to pale, and worked the land with tools their grandfathers had used. They typically planted rye, oats, peas and barley, and harvested crops with a scythe, sickle or reaper. In the evenings, when the work was done, they gathered around their hearths to share simple meals of bread and pottage, a kind of thick hot stew made out of grains and whatever vegetables were in season, enlivened by a few herbs and possibly the odd bit of bacon or fish. They believed in things we might find quaint now, but which were as real to them as the sunrise. They believed in spirits that dwelt in the heart of ancient oak trees, in holy wells whose waters could heal the sick and bless the newborn, in a richly adorned statue of the Virgin Mary known as Our Lady of Woolpit, which was an object of veneration and pilgrimage, perhaps as early as the 13th century. They believed in the thin places, the borderlands, where the world of everyday life touched something deeper, something other, something that whispered of mysteries beyond human understanding. England in these years was caught in the terrible grip of what history would call the Anarchy, a rather tumultuous time in England's history called the Anarchy in the mid-12th century, a civil war that would rage for nearly 20 blood-soaked years, pitting brother against brother, noble against noble, in a struggle for the crown that left the countryside scarred and the people exhausted. But here in Woolpit, 7 miles east of the market town of Bury St Edmunds, far from the courts and battlefields where kings and nobles played their deadly games, life moved at the eternal pace of seasons. Between 1174 and 1180, Walter de Coutances, a confidant of King Henry II, was appointed to Woolpit. After his death or retirement, it was to be granted to the monks of Bury St Edmunds Abbey. The great abbey cast its spiritual shadow over the village, its bells carrying across the countryside, its monks walking the ancient roads with their brown robes and peaceful faces, bringing news from the outside world, carrying letters, offering prayers for the sick and dying. During the Middle Ages, it belonged to the Abbey of Bury St Edmunds, and was part of one of the most densely populated areas in rural England. The villagers planted their crops in spring, when the earth softened and the first green shoots pushed through the dark soil. They harvested in autumn, when the fields turned gold and the air grew crisp with the promise of winter. They trusted that the world would continue much as it always had, generation following generation, in the same houses, working the same fields, praying in the same stone church, living and dying in the gentle embrace of tradition. The village was a real community. Neighbours looked out for each other because it was not in anyone's interest to let 1 or 2 families starve through bad luck. There were feast days, church holidays and fairs to break up the work cycles. Children played in the village green, their laughter echoing off the cottage walls. Women gathered at the village well to draw water and share the day's gossip. Men worked side by side in the fields, sharing tools and knowledge, helping each other through the endless cycle of planting and harvest. They had no way of knowing, as they went about their daily tasks, kneading bread, tending sheep, mending thatch, that something extraordinary was gathering at the very edge of their familiar world, something that would challenge everything they thought they knew about the nature of existence, about the boundaries between the possible and the impossible, about the thin places where one world touches another. The fields around Woolpit were particularly beautiful in late summer, when our story begins. Golden wheat swayed in gentle breezes that carried the scent of ripening grain, of wildflowers, of the distant woods where deer browsed in dappled shade. England's environment continued to be shaped throughout the period. through the building of dikes to drain marshes, tree clearance, and the large-scale extraction of peat. The countryside was wilder then, more forested, home to creatures that have long since vanished. Wild flowers dotted the meadows with splashes of brilliant colour, cornflowers blue as summer sky, poppies red as blood, daisies white as fresh milk. The ancient wolf pits, now softened by decades of neglect, had become part of the landscape, overgrown with brambles heavy with blackberries, wild herbs that the village women gathered for cooking and healing, forget-me-nots and ladies' bedstraw. They were forgotten by all except the oldest villagers, those whose grandfathers remembered when the pits still served their original purpose, when the howl of wolves could still be heard on winter nights, echoing across the fields like voices from another world. In medieval times there were two guilds in Woolpit, the Guild of the Holy Trinity and the Guild of Our Blessed Lady. Wax, money and other items were left to these guilds. The guilds brought the community together, organising feast days and holy days, ensuring that the poor were fed, that the sick were tended, that no one died alone. In the 13th century, Woolpit was granted licences for a weekly market and 2 annual fairs. These brought excitement and prosperity. Merchants from distant towns, goods from far lands, stories from the wide world beyond the village boundaries. There were 2 of them, the cow fair and the horse fair. The cow fair seems to have been discontinued sometime in the 17th century, but the horse fair persisted well into the 19th century. On fair days the village would transform, filled with the sounds of lowing cattle, neighing horses, the shouts of merchants, the laughter of children, the music of travelling minstrels who brought news and songs from the great world. But those days of celebration were still in the future. Our story begins in the quieter time, when the harvest was nearly done, when the village dozed in the warm embrace of late summer. And it was there, near those ancient pits, forgotten monuments to a wilder time, that the impossible would soon make itself known. But for now, in this peaceful moment before mystery arrived, the village slept in innocence, unaware that 2 children unlike any they had ever seen, carrying with them the scent of other worlds, were about to step out of legend and into their carefully ordered lives, bringing with them questions that would echo through the centuries, mysteries that would never be fully solved, wonders that would challenge everything they thought they knew about the nature of reality itself. It was late summer, or perhaps early autumn. The exact season matters less than the feeling of that precious time, when the harvest was at its peak, when the air carried the golden scent of ripening grain and the sweet perfume of wildflowers, when the light had that particular quality that speaks of endings and beginnings, of the eternal cycle that had governed life in this peaceful corner of England since time immemorial. At harvest time one day during the reign of King Stephen, according to William of Newburgh, when the August sun was casting long shadows across the stubbled fields, a group of villagers was working the harvest near the edge of Woolpit, men and women who had known each other all their lives, whose families had worked this same land for generations beyond memory, whose hands knew the weight of scythes and sickles, whose backs were bent from decades of honest labour under the Suffolk sky. This was the wheat harvest, the most important, the most critical time of the entire farming year, the time when everyone had to work from the break of day until dusk fell, every day, including sometimes even on Sundays. Because if the harvest was not finished on time, if the grain was left too long in the fields, the wheat would be destroyed by the cold and rain, and the village was likely to face starvation through the long winter months ahead. The villagers moved with the easy rhythm of those who understood the seasons, who could read the sky for signs of rain, who knew exactly when the grain was ready, not too dry that it would fall off, not too wet that it would rot. They worked in groups, families labouring side by side, using scythes and sickles to cut the golden stalks, their movements synchronised by years of practice, by the ancient dance of the harvest that connected them to their ancestors and their children. The tools were simple but effective. The scythe, with its long curved blade, could cut through the wheat in great sweeping arcs, while the smaller sickle was better for more delicate work, for cutting around obstacles, for gathering the grain in neat bundles. Originally, the sickle was the harvesting tool of choice, but it was quickly replaced following the introduction of the more time-efficient scythe, though both required skill, strength, and endless patience. Conversations flowed easily as they worked, punctuated by the rhythmic whisper of blades through grain, by the laughter of children who ran between the workers, carrying water and small bundles, learning the skills they would need when they were old enough to take their place in the harvest. This was more than work, it was community. It was the binding together of lives in the shared struggle to wrest sustenance from the earth. The air was filled with the sounds of productivity, with life lived in harmony with the seasons. The gentle thud of grain falling into baskets, the calls of workers to one another across the fields, the distant lowing of cattle being driven to fresh pasture, the song of larks rising from the stubble, all of it woven together into the symphony of a world at peace with itself, a world where mystery was still possible, where wonders could emerge from the most ordinary of days. This was England in the 12th century, when the countryside was wilder, more forested, when the boundary between the known and unknown was thinner, when people lived closer to the earth, and perhaps, because of that closeness, closer to the impossible, their world was bounded by the village, by the fields they knew, by the ancient roads that connected them to other settlements. But beyond those boundaries, anything might exist, anything might be possible. And then, without warning, without any sense of approaching strangeness, without any portent or sign to prepare them for what they were about to witness, 2 children appeared at the edge of the fields. They seemed to materialize from the very air, standing near one of the ancient wolf pits that gave the village its name, as if they had simply stepped through an invisible doorway from one world into another. They were holding hands, a boy and a girl, the boy perhaps 5 or 6 years old, small for his age, with the delicate features of a child who has never known plenty. The girl, slightly older, maybe 8, with an air of protective watchfulness, her thin arm wrapped around her brother's shoulders, as if she could shield him from whatever this strange new world might bring. They stood very still, very quiet, like deer that have suddenly found themselves in an unfamiliar meadow. Their eyes were wide, dark, filled with a bewilderment that touched something deep in the villagers' hearts, filled with the kind of confusion that speaks of profound displacement, of finding oneself in a place that defies all understanding, all expectation. But it wasn't their stillness that made the villagers stop their work. It wasn't their obvious confusion. It wasn't even their unfamiliar clothing. Strange though it was, made of material none of them had ever seen, woven in patterns that belonged to no tradition they knew, cut in a style that seemed to come from another age, another place, another way of understanding how cloth should embrace the human form. It was their skin. Their skin was green, not pale green, not sickly, not the colour of someone who had been ill or malnourished. This was a full, vibrant green, like the colour of new leaves in spring, like moss growing on ancient stones, like the deep heart of the forest in summer. It was as if they had been painted by nature herself, as if they belonged more to the plant world than to the human one, as if chlorophyll flowed in their veins instead of blood. The villagers approached slowly, cautiously. These were people who understood that the world held mysteries, who had been raised on stories of strange happenings, of visitors from the fairy realm, of spirits that dwelt in holy wells and ancient oak trees. But understanding such things in story was different from facing them in the bright light of an ordinary harvest day. different from seeing with their own eyes what could not possibly exist. The children didn't run. They seemed too confused, too frightened, too overwhelmed by the sensory assault of this new world to flee. Their eyes darted from face to face, from the scythes in the workers' hands to the bundles of grain scattered about, to the bright blue sky above, as if they had never seen such colours, such light, such vivid reality. When the villagers tried to speak to them, offering gentle words of comfort in the soft Suffolk dialect, the children only made soft, whispery sounds. Not quite words, not quite crying, but something between the two, a language none of them recognised, though some had travelled to nearby markets, had heard French and Latin in the churches, had even encountered the occasional merchant from distant lands. This was different. This was something that seemed to flow like water, like wind through leaves, like voices from a dream. The children's language, if it was a language, seemed to come from some deeper place, some older tradition. It carried rhythms that human ears could barely follow, melodies that seemed to echo in the bones rather than the mind. When they spoke to each other, which they did in quick, urgent whispers, it was as if they were discussing not just their immediate situation, but the very nature of existence, the possibility that the world could change so completely, so suddenly. Gradually, with the infinite patience of country folk who understood that fear makes any creature unpredictable, the villagers managed to coax the children away from the wolf pits. It took time, gentle words, slow movements, the offering of hands that held no tools, no threat, just the human desire to help, to comfort, to bridge the gap between the known and the unknowable. The children allowed themselves to be led, though every step seemed to cost them effort, as if they were walking through water or moving against some invisible current that pulled them back toward the place where they had appeared. Their green skin seemed to shimmer in the afternoon light, taking on different hues as they moved from shadow to sunshine, from gold green to blue green, to the deep forest green of old growth trees. They were brought to the home of Sir Richard de Calne of Wykes, a local landowner who lived 6 miles north of Woolpit, a man known throughout the area for his learning, his curiosity, and his kindness to strangers. Ralph of Coggeshall, writing his account in the 1220s, drew on Sir Richard's own testimony, making him not just a witness, but a participant in this most impossible of events. Sir Richard was what passed for an educated man in 12th century England. He could read Latin, owned several books, had served his time as a knight in the service of greater lords. He had travelled beyond the boundaries of his own lands, had seen the court at Westminster, had met men from distant countries. If anyone could help these strange children, if anyone could unravel the mystery of their presence, it would be him. His household was comfortable by the standards of the time. The manor house was built of good stone, with thick walls that kept out the cold and windows that let in the light. Tapestries added warmth and colour to the great hall, where a fire burned constantly in the massive hearth, casting dancing shadows that made the room feel alive, welcoming, safe. It was a place where travellers were welcomed, where strange stories were collected like precious stones, where the unusual was met with interest rather than fear. The children were given a place to rest. Soft bedding was prepared in a warm chamber, fresh rushes were scattered on the floor, and clean water was brought for washing. The servants moved quietly, carefully, sensing that these were no ordinary foundlings, that something momentous had entered their orderly world, something that would be remembered and spoken of for generations to come. And then, the matter of food. The kitchen prepared the best they had to offer: fresh bread, still warm from the oven, its crust golden and crisp, its interior white and soft as clouds; rich stew, made with vegetables from the manor's own gardens and meat from animals raised in their own fields; fresh milk, creamy and sweet, from cows that grazed in the green pastures just beyond the manor walls. Cheese aged in the manor's cool cellars, honey from hives tended by the manor's own beekeeper, apples and pears from the orchard, their skin bright with morning dew, everything that represented the bounty of this good earth, the richness of a well-ordered household, the generosity of a lord who understood that hospitality was a sacred duty. But the children wouldn't eat. They looked at the food with something approaching horror, something deeper than simple unfamiliarity, something that suggested a fundamental incompatibility between their nature and the offerings of this world. They cried when it was brought near, soft, heartbreaking sounds that seemed to come from some deep place of the loss, of homesickness for something no one could name or understand. Their distress was profound. It went beyond the normal fear of strange food in a strange place. It was as if their very beings rejected this reality, as if the sustenance that kept the people of Woolpit alive was poison to them, as if they came from a world where different rules applied, where different kinds of nourishment were required to maintain life. Days passed in this manner, the children growing weaker, more listless, their green skin taking on a paler hue, as if the very light of this world was slowly draining them of whatever force had given them life. The household watched with growing concern. Sir Richard consulted with the village priest, with the local wise women, with anyone who might have knowledge of such things, but no one had ever seen or heard of anything like this. The villagers feared they would die, not from any illness they could understand, but from some fundamental incompatibility with the world they had found themselves in. It was as if their spirits were slowly being worn down by the effort of existing in the wrong reality, of breathing air that was too thick, of living under a sun that was too bright, of trying to survive in a place where their very essence was alien. And then, someone had an idea. Perhaps it was one of the kitchen servants, a woman who tended the manor's vegetable gardens and understood the subtle differences between plants. Or perhaps it was a gardener who had been watching the children's distress and thinking about what might comfort them. They brought raw green beans, still in their pods, still carrying the smell of the garden, the taste of earth and rain and growing things. The children's reaction was immediate and profound. They perked up as if they had been offered water after days in the desert. They reached for the beans with something like recognition, like relief, like the joy of finding something familiar in an utterly foreign world. They devoured them hungrily, eagerly, as if they had been starving for something they couldn't name until this moment. Watching them eat, seeing the colour return to their green skin, witnessing their obvious relief and comfort, was like watching flowers bloom after a long drought. It was clear that they had found, not just food, but a connection to whatever world they had come from, a bridge between their nature and this reality, a way to exist, at least temporarily, in a place that was not their own. And so, they lived, sustained by the only food from this world that their bodies would accept. The green children of Woolpit had found their first foothold in a reality that was not their own. But this was only the beginning of a story that would unfold slowly, gently, like a flower opening to reveal secrets at its heart, secrets about the nature of worlds, about the boundaries between the possible and impossible, about the mystery that dwells just beyond the edge of everything we think we know. The villagers watched them, not with the cruel curiosity of those who gawk at oddities, but with the gentle fascination of people who recognize something miraculous, something that touched the very edges of the possible. These were country folk who understood that the world held mysteries, who had been raised on stories of saints and miracles, of strange visitations and impossible happenings. But even for them, this was something beyond anything they had ever witnessed or imagined. These were not ordinary children, and everyone knew it, yet there was something deeply profoundly human about their confusion, their fear, their need for kindness and comfort. They moved with a strange grace, as if they were listening to music no one else could hear, as if they were following rhythms that belonged to another world, another way of being, another understanding of time and space and the fundamental nature of existence. The girl stayed close to her brother, protective, watchful, her thin green fingers often touching his shoulder, his hand, his hair, as if to reassure herself that he was still there, still real, still breathing, in this impossible place they had found themselves. Her eyes, dark and luminous, seemed to hold depths that spoke of other skies, other seasons, other ways of seeing the world. The boy remained sickly and frail from the very beginning. Despite eating the green beans, despite the care he received from Sir Richard's household, despite the gentle attention of servants who had seen to the needs of many travellers, his thin body seemed to struggle with the very air he breathed. Some days he would sit for hours, staring at nothing, his green skin pale with an exhaustion that sleep couldn't cure, as if his spirit belonged elsewhere and was slowly being worn down by the effort of existing in the wrong world. It was as if his very essence was incompatible with this reality, with the weight of English air, with the rhythm of English seasons, with the solid, unforgiving nature of a world where the sun moved across the sky in predictable patterns, where night followed day in eternal succession, where the light was too bright, too harsh, too demanding for a being who had been born to live in perpetual twilight. They were given a place to sleep in Sir Richard's household, a warm chamber with windows that looked out over the manor gardens, where they could watch the familiar green of growing things, the play of light on leaves, the gentle movement of branches in the wind. The servants brought them soft woolen blankets, fresh rushes for the floor, and patience, endless patience, as the children slowly, so slowly, began to adapt to their new reality. The household moved around them with careful consideration, understanding instinctively that these were not ordinary foundlings, that something momentous had entered their orderly world. The cook prepared special portions of beans, experimenting with different preparations to see what the children would accept. The chambermaid brought fresh flowers from the garden, thinking that the scent of growing things might comfort them. The stable boys offered to show them the horses, the gentle creatures who might bridge the gap between the familiar and the strange. Over the weeks and months that followed, something remarkable began to happen. The children started to understand, not just the sounds of English, but the rhythms of this world, the way people moved through their days, the way they laughed and sang and worked and rested, the way they showed affection and concern. It was as if they were learning not just a language, but an entire way of being, an entirely different approach to existence. The girl proved quicker at this learning, more adaptable, more willing to embrace the strangeness of her new world. She would repeat words, softly, carefully, her voice carrying a musical quality that made even the simplest phrases sound like poetry, like incantations, like prayers spoken in a tongue that had been touched by otherworldly beauty. Water, she would say, and somehow the word became more than just a request. It became a bridge between worlds, a connection between the possible and the impossible. Bread, though she still could not eat it, sun, spoken with a wonder that suggested she had never seen one quite like this. Sky, as if the blue dome above England was a revelation, a miracle of colour that her twilight world had never shown her. Each word was a small victory, a tiny step toward understanding, toward finding a place in a reality that had not been made for her. The boy's progress was slower, more hesitant, more fragile. He would sometimes speak in their original tongue, long strings of sounds that flowed like water, like wind through leaves, like voices from a dream that refused to fade. The girl would answer him in the same language, and for a moment they would seem to disappear back into whatever world they had come from, their green skin seeming to glow with a light that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth. When they spoke together in their own language, the very air in the room seemed to change, to become softer, more liquid, more alive with possibilities. It was as if their words carried with them the essence of their homeland, the scent of eternal twilight, the sound of bells ringing in places where no bells should exist, the memory of a place where different rules applied, where different kinds of light illuminated different kinds of truth. But gradually even the boy began to learn. He would point at things, repeat their names, smile shyly when he got them right. The servants grew fond of him, this strange, gentle child who seemed to carry sadness in his very bones, who moved through the world as if he were made of glass, as if a harsh word or a sudden movement might shatter him into 1,000 pieces. They would bring him flowers from the garden, which he would hold for hours, turning them over in his small hands, studying them with the intensity of a scholar, as if they were messages from home, as if the roses and lilies and sweet herbs of Sir Richard's manor carried whispers from the place he had left behind, the place he could never quite forget, never quite reach. The villagers came to accept them, not as curiosities, but as part of the community. Children would play with them, though the games were often modified, simpler, more gentle, more suited to beings who seemed too fragile for the rough and tumble of ordinary childhood. The green children couldn't run as fast, or as far, but they could sit quietly and weave flower crowns, their fingers moving with an otherworldly dexterity that produced creations of impossible beauty. They could listen to stories, their eyes wide with wonder at tales of knights and dragons, of saints and miracles, of the ordinary magic that humans created with nothing but words and imagination, and they could simply exist in that peaceful way that made everyone around them feel calmer, more centered, more aware of the deeper rhythms that connected all living things. The medieval rite of baptism was a very serious and important ceremony, full of rich meaning and symbolism. Without baptism, there was no hope of heaven, and together with the Eucharist it was regarded as one of the two most significant of the 7 sacraments considered necessary for salvation. The decision to baptize the children was not made lightly. It represented their formal acceptance into the Christian community, their spiritual adoption into a faith they did not yet understand, but which offered them protection and belonging in this alien world. The baptismal service would have been much longer and more elaborate than modern services. It began in the church porch, where the priest made the sign of the cross 3 times, recited appropriate prayers, and commanded the devil to depart from the children. Jesus is welcome to children. Suffer little children and forbid them not to come unto me, for of such is the kingdom of heaven, was read with particular poignancy, for these were children who had truly come from afar. But the boy, the sweet, fragile boy, never grew stronger. His body, thin and pale beneath the green tint, began to fail in ways that no one could understand. Some said it was illness, others said it was grief, perhaps a homesickness so profound that it affected his very ability to continue existing. Perhaps the food of this world was too different, too alien to his system, or perhaps the world itself was. Perhaps his very essence was incompatible with the heavy air, the bright sun, the solid reality of 12th century England. Medieval people witnessed a staggering number of child deaths, both in and around the household, as well as in the wider community. Historians estimate that rates were similar to late Tudor death counts, with 400 to 500 children out of every 1,000 dying before the age of 10. Death was a constant presence, a shadow that lurked around every corner, ready to claim even the youngest and most innocent members of society. But this death, when it came, was different, quieter, more mysterious than the usual childhood illnesses and accidents that claimed so many young lives. The boy died within a few months, quietly, peacefully, in his sleep, as if he had simply decided to return to whatever realm had given him birth, as if his spirit had finally grown too weary to maintain its tenuous hold on this unfamiliar reality. The girl found him in the morning, and her grief was unlike anything the villagers had ever witnessed. She didn't cry in the way they understood crying. She keened, a sound that seemed to come from the very heart of the earth, from the deep places where sorrow lives, from the ancient wellsprings of loss that connect all living things. It was a sound that made everyone who heard it remember every loss they had ever experienced, every goodbye that had come too soon, every love that had been torn away by forces beyond human control. Her keening was not just for her brother, it was for their lost world, for the twilight land they would never see again, for the parents they had left behind, for the cattle they had been tending when they wandered into that strange tunnel, for everything familiar and beloved that had been stripped away in a single moment of bewildering transition. They buried him in the churchyard with full Christian rites, though no one was quite sure what god he might have prayed to in his homeland. What rituals had marked the passages of his short life? What songs had been sung over his cradle? The priest spoke words of comfort over the small grave, words about resurrection and eternal life, about the gathering of souls in the kingdom of heaven. But it was the girl's silence that truly honoured him, the way she stood so still and so straight, like a young tree weathering its first storm. Medieval death was public, and people heard day and night that life afterward would be better, so why fear it? But this death carried with it the weight of mystery, the sense that something precious and irreplaceable had been lost, not just to the family who had cared for the boy, but to the world itself. For he had been a bridge between realms, a living proof that reality was larger and stranger than anyone had imagined. The girl remained. She mourned her brother, not with the wild grief of the newly bereaved, but with a deep, abiding sadness that seemed to become part of her, like a scar that would never fully heal. But she stayed under Sir Richard's care, and in time, slowly, carefully, began to thrive in ways her brother never could. Her green colour, which had been so vivid, so impossible, began to fade, whether from exposure to sunlight, from a shift in diet, or from some other cause no one could name. Her skin gradually turned to a more normal hue, not the pale pink of the villagers, but a warm, olive tone that spoke of distant places, of bloodlines that belonged to other lands, of origins that could never be fully explained or understood. The transformation was gradual, subtle, like the changing of seasons, like watching a leaf slowly turn from green to gold. Her skin took on new tones, new depths, until she looked almost, but never quite, like any other child in the village. The change was both a loss and a gift, a sign that she was adapting to this world, but also a reminder of how far she had travelled, how much she had left behind. As she grew older, she integrated into village life with a grace that amazed everyone. She was baptized in the little stone church, taking the name Agnes, a name that meant pure, or holy, though she would always carry with her something that was not quite of this world, something that whispered of other places, other possibilities, other ways of being human. She learned to speak fluently, though her voice always carried that musical quality, that hint of otherworldly poetry that made even ordinary conversation sound like song. She helped with the household tasks, learned to spin and weave, to tend the gardens, to care for the animals, and slowly became part of the fabric of Woolpit life, though threads of mystery would always run through that fabric, reminding everyone who knew her that the world was larger and stranger than they had ever imagined. And then, when she was old enough, when she had lived among them long enough to be trusted with the deepest mysteries, when her English was fluent enough to carry the weight of such impossible truths, she told her story. The story of where she and her brother had come from, and how they had found their way to the wolf pits of Woolpit. It was a story that would be remembered and retold and puzzled over for centuries to come. A story that opened windows onto possibilities that most people preferred to keep firmly closed. When Agnes finally spoke of her homeland, it was with the careful precision of someone who knows that her words will be doubted, that her memories will be questioned, that her very experience will be measured against the possible and found wanting. But she told it anyway, because it was the truth as she remembered it, the truth of a world that existed, if it existed at all, just beyond the edge of everything familiar, everything that the people of Woolpit thought they knew about the nature of reality. She had lived among them for years by then, had learned their language not just with her tongue but with her heart, had come to understand the rhythms of their days, the patterns of their seasons, the deep currents of belief and custom that shaped their lives. She knew that what she was about to tell them would challenge everything they thought they understood about the world, about the boundaries between the possible and the impossible, about the nature of existence itself. She said they came from a place called Saint, Martin's Land. The name itself carried a weight of mystery, a suggestion of sanctity that made it somehow more acceptable to medieval minds. Saint Martin, a saint known for his kindness, for his protection of travellers, for his ability to bridge the gap between the holy and the everyday. But this was not the saint, Martin of church teachings, not the bishop who had cut his cloak in half to share with a beggar. This was something else, something that borrowed the name but existed in a realm all its own. Medieval folklore closely associated St. Martin with symbols of death and rebirth, with the turning of seasons, with the thin times when the veil between worlds grew gossamer fine. He was often depicted mounted on a horse, a common symbol of passage between realms, carrying a stick that represented resurrection, the power to bring life from death, hope from despair. It was fitting, perhaps, that the children should claim to come from a land bearing his name, for they themselves seemed to exist in the spaces between life and death, between the familiar and the impossible. It was a land, she said, of perpetual twilight, never full daylight, never total darkness, but something between, something that human language could barely describe, something that existed in the gentle margin between day and night, where shadows held substance and light carried weight. The sun never rose above the horizon. It hung there, constant and distant, like a far-off ember behind layers of mist, casting long shadows that never shortened, painting everything in shades of gold and amber and deep, deep green. Agnes struggled to find words in English for what she remembered, for concepts that had no equivalent in this bright, harsh world of moving light and changing skies. She spoke of a sun that was not like their sun, that did not wheel across the heavens in its daily journey, but remained fixed, eternal, providing just enough illumination to see by, just enough warmth to sustain life, but never the blazing intensity that made this English sky so difficult for her eyes to bear. In this place, she said, everyone was green. It was not strange there and not remarkable, not a sign of otherness or illness. It was simply the way of things, the natural colour of human skin in a world where the light was different, where the very air carried a verdant quality that seeped into everything, into the people, into the animals, into the stones themselves. Children were born green, lived green, died green, and thought nothing of it, for in their world it was as natural as breathing. She spoke of rivers that flowed with water so clear it seemed like liquid crystal, reflecting the eternal twilight in depth that seemed to go down forever. These waters carried no silt, no debris, but flowed clean and pure from springs that bubbled up from unknown depths, feeding a landscape that never quite knew drought, never quite knew flood, but existed in perfect balance, in eternal stasis between too much and too little. There were cities, she said, built from stone that glowed with its own inner light, not the harsh glare of torches or candles, but a soft, warm radiance that seemed to come from within the very walls themselves. These cities rose in graceful spires and gentle curves, following the natural contours of the land, never fighting against the landscape but flowing with it, becoming part of it, as if they had grown rather than been built. And across the water, always visible but somehow always unreachable, lay a great shining land, a place of such beauty that even the memory of it brought tears to Agnes's eyes. She could never quite explain what made it so beautiful, what gave it that quality of impossible perfection, but she said it called to everyone who looked upon it, promising something that could never quite be grasped, never quite be reached, but always, always hoped for. There were no seasons in St. Martin's Land, or rather, there was only one season, a constant autumn that never deepened into winter, never brightened into spring. The trees were always turning, their leaves forever on the verge of falling, but never quite letting go. It was a world suspended in a moment of perfect, eternal change, where transformation was always beginning but never ending, where the promise of movement existed without the reality of progression. The people there, she said, lived differently than they did in Woolpit. They moved more slowly, spoke more softly, seemed to exist in harmony with the twilight rhythms of their world. Time itself flowed differently, less urgently, more gently, without the pressing demands of suns that set and rose, of seasons that demanded planting and harvest, of urgent tasks that could not wait for tomorrow. They were not sad exactly, but they carried a kind of gentle melancholy, the way one feels when watching a beautiful sunset, knowing it will end, but treasuring it all the more for its impermanence. Life in St. Martin's Land was suffused with this bittersweet quality, this awareness of beauty that was both eternal and fragile, permanent and fleeting, real and somehow just beyond the reach of full understanding. The architecture of their world reflected this eternal twilight. Buildings with walls that curved like flowing water, roofs that followed the shape of clouds, windows that were more like openings to the sky than barriers against the weather. Everything was designed to work with the soft, eternal light, to channel it, to shape it, to make it part of the living space rather than something to be shut out or controlled. When asked how they had come to Woolpit, Agnes grew quiet, thoughtful, as if she was trying to translate an experience that had no words, even in the language of her birth. The transition from her world to this one was not something that could be easily explained, not something that followed the normal rules of travel or geography. It was more like waking from a dream, or falling into one, a shift that happened not in space but in the very nature of reality itself. She said they had been tending to their father's cattle, following the animals as they grazed in the endless twilight, when the beasts wandered toward a place they had never seen before. The landscape of St. Martin's Land was familiar to them, every hill and valley known, every stream and meadow part of their daily world, but this place, this opening, was new, or perhaps it had always been there but invisible, waiting for the right moment, the right combination of circumstances to reveal itself. There was a cave, or perhaps it was a tunnel. Agnes was never quite sure. The opening was small, unremarkable, the kind of place one might pass by 100 times without noticing. But the cattle seemed drawn to it, compelled by something they sensed but could not name, and she and her brother, curious as children always are, followed them into the darkness, into the space between worlds, into the passage that should not have existed but did. The deeper they went, the darker it became, until they were walking in absolute blackness, feeling their way along stone walls that seemed to pulse with their own heartbeat. The cattle had disappeared, whether ahead or behind or into some other dimension entirely. They couldn't tell. There was only the tunnel, and the sense that they were moving not just through space, but through something else. Something that had no name in any language. Something that connected what was to what might be. The walls of the tunnel were strange to the touch. Not quite stone, not quite earth, but something that seemed alive, organic, as if they were walking through the body of some vast creature, or through the dreams of a sleeping god. The surface under their hands was warm, slightly yielding, and it seemed to respond to their presence, guiding them, drawing them forward, pulling them deeper into the mystery. And then, suddenly, without warning, they emerged into a blinding place of sound and light. The sun, their first experience of a sun that actually moved across the sky, was so bright it hurt their eyes, made them stumble and weep. The sounds of the village, of people talking and laughing and working, were overwhelming after the profound silence of their twilight world. It was like being born, like emerging from the womb of one reality into the harsh brightness of another. They found themselves near the wolf pits, confused, frightened, unable to understand where they were or how they had gotten there. The tunnel behind them, if it had ever existed at all, was gone. There was only the bright, noisy, overwhelming reality of 12th century England, with its moving sun and changing light, its urgent rhythms and demanding seasons, its people who lived in constant motion rather than eternal stillness. But Agnes remembered something else, something that haunted her dreams long after her green skin had faded, long after she had learned to speak English fluently, long after she'd taken her place in the community of Woolpit. She remembered hearing a great sound just before they emerged, not quite music, not quite noise, but something that seemed to fill the very air with vibration, something that reached not just the ears but the bones, the blood, the deepest parts of the soul. It was like the ringing of bells, she said, but bells made of something other than metal, bells that rang in harmonies no earthly instrument could produce, bells made of crystal, perhaps, or of light itself, or of the kind of music that exists only in the spaces between worlds, between one kind of reality and another. The sound was so complex, so layered, that it seemed to contain within it all the music that had ever been or ever could be. The sound was so loud, so overwhelming, that it seemed to stop their thoughts, to make them forget, for a moment, who they were, where they had come from, why they were walking through darkness toward an unknown destination. It was as if the bells were rewriting reality, preparing them for the transition, erasing their connection to one world so they could exist, however briefly, however precariously, in another. And then, silence, profound and complete, more absolute than any quiet they had ever known, followed by the shock of light and the bewildering discovery that they were no longer home, no longer in the gentle twilight of St. Martin's Land, but in a place where the sun moved and the light changed and everything was harsh and bright and impossibly, overwhelmingly, real. Some say it was a secret passage between worlds, others that it was a metaphor, a child's confused memory of trauma or travel, but Agnes insisted, even as she grew older, even as she became more fully part of the world she had found herself in, even as she married and had children of her own, that they had not come from England, not from Earth, as it was known. They had come from somewhere else, somewhere that existed in the spaces between the familiar and the impossible. And the bells, she would say, when pressed about the details, when asked to explain what could not be explained, the bells were still ringing, Somewhere, in the deep places, in the caves that connected world to world, in the passages that existed between one kind of reality and another, anyone who listened carefully, on quiet nights, when the wind was still and the world held its breath, could hear them, calling, always calling into those who had the ears to understand, the heart to believe, the courage to step through doors that should not exist but do. The story she told was impossible, but it was told with such detail, such consistency, such quiet conviction, that even the most skeptical listeners found themselves wondering, what if? What if there really were other worlds, other ways of being, other kinds of light and time and space? What if the boundaries they took for granted were not as solid as they seemed? What if mystery was not the enemy of truth but its deepest companion? Agnes lived with her story, carried it through her long life like a treasure, like a burden, like a gift that was too precious to share carelessly, but too important to keep entirely to herself. And those who knew her, who heard her speak of St. Martin's Land with that faraway look in her eyes, found themselves changed, touched by the possibility that the world was larger, stranger, more wonderful than they had ever dared to imagine. For centuries, the story of the Green Children has lingered in the background of British folklore, not quite a fairy tale, not quite history, but something in between, something that refuses to be categorized, to be explained away, to be forgotten. It exists in that liminal space where the documented meets the impossible, where careful records bump up against the edges of wonder, where the rational mind encounters mysteries that seem designed to humble human understanding. The story was recorded not once, but twice, by different chroniclers, in different places, at different times. This parallel documentation suggests something more than mere folklore, more than the usual embellishment that transforms ordinary events into extraordinary tales. William of Newburgh, a careful historian who prided himself on accuracy, who served as a canon at the Augustinian Newburgh Priory far to the north in Yorkshire, wrote about the Green Children in his Historia Rerum Anglicarum around 1189. William presented it not as folklore, not as allegory, but as a factual account, something that had actually happened, something that deserved to be preserved alongside the wars and politics and great events that shaped the kingdom. He stated that his account was based on reports from a number of trustworthy sources, suggesting that the story was not the invention of a single imagination, but the convergent testimony of multiple witnesses, people who had seen, who had spoken with Agnes herself, who carried the weight of impossible truth. Ralph of Coggeshall, while writing independently in his Chronicum Anglicanum in the 1220s, included his own version of the story. Ralph was the abbot of Cistercian Coggeshall Abbey, about 26 miles south of Woolpit, a man of learning and responsibility, not given to flights of fancy or the preservation of idle tales. His version differs in some details, but the essential elements remain the same. 2 green children, appearing near wolf pits, speaking an unknown language, unable to eat normal food, telling stories of a twilight land beyond human understanding. Most significantly, Ralph drew on the account of Sir Richard de Calne of Wykes himself, the man who had sheltered the children in his manor house, who had witnessed their adaptation, their struggles, their impossible nature firsthand. This was not second-hand storytelling, not the embellishment of distant rumours, but the testimony of the primary caretaker, the man who had fed them, housed them, watched them learn to speak, buried the boy, and listened to Agnes tell her story of St. Martin's Land. Medieval chroniclers were not given to flights of fancy. They lived in a world where the supernatural was accepted as part of reality, where miracles and strange happenings were part of the ordinary fabric of existence, but they still distinguished between the probable and the impossible, between the normal course of events and the truly miraculous. For them to record this story, to preserve it alongside accounts of wars and political events, suggests that they believed it to be true, or at least significant enough to warrant preservation for future generations. But what kind of truth were they preserving? That question has puzzled scholars for centuries and given rise to theories that range from the mundane to the extraordinary, from the carefully rational to the boldly speculative. Each generation has looked at the story through the lens of its own understanding, its own sense of what is possible, its own need to either explain away the mystery or embrace it as evidence of deeper truths. The most common explanation, the one that allows modern minds to rest easy, is that the children were Flemish refugees, displaced by one of the many wars that swept through medieval Europe like deadly storms. In the 12th century, more Flemish migrants arrived in England, fleeing environmental disasters and overpopulation. Henry I welcomed them, gifting them land in Pembrokeshire, from where they spread throughout England, seeking new lives in a new land. But their good fortune did not last. Henry II started persecuting the Flemish in 1154, believing they impeded English trade. The town of Farnham St Martin is not far from Woolpit, just north of Bury St Edmunds. In 1173, it was the site of the Battle of Farnham, during the civil war between King Henry II and his son, the young King Henry. Rebel forces led by Robert de Beaumont, together with a large number of Flemish mercenaries, had landed in Suffolk, but were defeated by royal forces on the banks of the River Lark. The Flemish mercenaries were slaughtered, and historians suggest that there might have been violence against peaceful Flemish settlers in the area, families who had nothing to do with the rebellion but who became targets simply because of their origin, children whose parents were killed, who fled into the dense Thetford forest, might have wandered in underground flint mines, chalk caves, forgotten passages carved by ancient peoples, until they found themselves near Woolpit, confused, traumatized, speaking only their native Flemish. In this theory, their green colour came from malnutrition, from a diet of nothing but wild plants, from what medieval medicine called green sickness, a condition that could affect the complexion, making skin take on unusual hues. Their strange clothing would simply be Flemish garb, unfamiliar to the Suffolk villagers. Their inability to eat normal food would result from trauma, from digestive problems caused by stress and poor nutrition, from the kind of physical and emotional damage that comes from witnessing unspeakable violence. This theory has the virtue of being reasonable, explainable, comfortable. It fits with what we know about the movement of peoples in medieval times, about the effects of poor nutrition on the human body, about the way trauma can affect memory, making the familiar seem strange, the recent seem distant. It allows us to preserve the essential humanity of the story while explaining away its impossible elements. But there are problems with this explanation. Significant problems that become more apparent the more closely one examines the details. The green colour wasn't described as sickly or pale. It was vibrant, healthy, like the colour of growing things, like chlorophyll itself flowing in their veins. And there's no record of any refugee movement in the area at the time. No evidence of war or displacement that would explain the presence of foreign children in rural Suffolk. Moreover, the children's rejection of normal food, their apparent inability to digest anything but green beans, suggests something more profound than simple unfamiliarity. It's as if their very biology was different, as if they had been adapted to a different kind of existence, a different kind of world. For an educated man like Richard de Caen, who had travelled, who knew languages, who had encountered foreigners, would not have recognised Flemish if that's what the children were speaking. Another theory suggests that the children were what we might now call feral, abandoned or lost at a young age, raised in isolation, perhaps in a heavily forested area where the light was dim and filtered, where their diet consisted mainly of wild plants and vegetation. This would explain their green colour, their difficulty with a normal food, their apparent unfamiliarity with human society and its customs. But this theory, too, has its difficulties. Feral children, while exhibiting unusual behaviours, don't typically develop green skin, and the children's story, Agnes's detailed account of St. Martin's Land, seems too coherent, too internally consistent, too rich in impossible detail, to be the product of a traumatised or isolated mind. Her descriptions had the quality of lived experience, of remembered truth, not the fragmented confusion of someone trying to piece together scattered memories. Some scholars have suggested that the story is entirely metaphorical, a parable about integration and assimilation, about the process by which outsiders become part of a community. The green skin representing otherness, difference, the mark of the foreign, the gradual colour change symbolising adaptation, the slow process of learning to belong, the boy's death illustrating the cost of change, the price some pay for attempting to bridge different worlds, the girl's survival and eventual marriage showing the possibility of successful integration. This interpretation has literary merit, psychological insight, sociological relevance. It transforms the story into a kind of medieval teaching tale, a way of exploring themes of belonging and acceptance, of the challenges faced by immigrants and refugees, of the price of assimilation, and the possibility of maintaining identity while adapting to new circumstances. But it requires us to believe that medieval chroniclers, practical men concerned with recording facts, would have preserved an elaborate metaphor as if it were historical truth. And then, there are the other theories, the ones that take the story at face value, that accept the possibility that Agnes was telling the literal truth about her origins. These theories venture into territory that makes rational minds uncomfortable, territory where the impossible becomes merely improbable, where the boundaries of reality prove more permeable than we usually assume. Some suggest that the children came from another dimension, that they slipped through a crack in reality, through what modern physics might call a portal or a wormhole, a temporary opening between parallel worlds. The tunnel they described, the cave that appeared and disappeared, could have been a brief connection between our reality and another, a passage that opened for just long enough to allow two children to slip through, before closing again, leaving no trace of its existence. In this interpretation, St. Martin's Land exists, or existed, in a dimension parallel to our own, a place where the laws of physics are slightly different, where the light spectrum includes wavelengths that would make human skin appear green, where the rhythm of time moves differently, where twilight is not a transition but a permanent state, where consciousness itself operates according to different principles. The idea of parallel dimensions, once the province of science fiction, has gained scientific respectability in recent decades. Quantum mechanics suggests that multiple realities might exist simultaneously, that what we experience as solid reality might be just one layer of a much more complex, much stranger universe. If such things are possible, then perhaps two children really did slip from one layer to another, carrying with them the memory of a world that exists just beyond our perception. Others have suggested that the children came from beneath the earth, from a vast underground realm inhabited by beings who have adapted to life without sunlight. Their green colour, in this theory, would be the result of a different kind of photosynthesis, a way of processing the dim light that filters down from the surface world, of drawing energy from sources unknown to surface dwellers. This underground civilization, if it exists, might be the source of many folklore traditions, the realm of the fairies, the kingdom of the dead, the underworld of mythology and legend. The children's emergence near the Woolpits, places that already connected the surface with the depths, would make sense in this context. They would be refugees from a hidden world, ambassadors from a civilization that has learned to remain invisible, to exist in the spaces that surface dwellers never think to explore. Still others have proposed that the children were time travellers, visitors from our own future, from a time when humanity has evolved, when our skin has adapted to different light conditions, when our biology has changed in response to environmental pressures we can't yet imagine. Their inability to eat our food, their gradual adaptation to our world, could be explained by the differences between their time and ours, between what we have become and what we once were. And then there's the possibility that has fascinated people for centuries, the idea that the children were not entirely human, that they belonged to a parallel race, a species that developed alongside humanity but remained hidden, living in the margins, in the forests, in the deep places, occasionally crossing over into our world. The rich tradition of European folklore, the stories of the fair folk, the hidden people, the beings who live just beyond the edge of human perception, might be based on real encounters with such beings. In this interpretation, the Green Children were ambassadors, visitors, refugees from a world that exists alongside ours but remains largely separate. They would be proof that humanity is not alone, that consciousness takes many forms, that intelligence has evolved along pathways we haven't even begun to imagine. Their story would be evidence of a larger, stranger, more wonderful reality than we usually allow ourselves to believe. Agnes lived into adulthood. That much is recorded in the careful chronicles of the time. Some accounts say she married a man from King's Lynn, about 40 miles from Woolpit, that she had children of her own, that she lived what appeared to be a normal life, indistinguishable from any other medieval woman. But other versions suggest that she eventually left Woolpit, that she vanished one day, returning, perhaps, to the twilight world she had never really forgotten. Based on research into Richard de Coun's family history, the astronomer and writer Duncan Lunan has concluded that the girl was given the name Agnes, and that she married a royal official named Richard Barr. If this is true, then she moved in circles of power and influence, her story known to those who shaped the kingdom, her impossible origins a whispered secret in the corridors of authority. Her later life is barely recorded, as if she had chosen to fade back into the mystery from which she had emerged, but her words echo still, her description of St. Martin's Land, her memory of the ringing bells, her insistence that somewhere, beyond the familiar world, there exists a place of eternal twilight, where people live in harmony with the gentle rhythms of endless autumn, where time moves differently, where the impossible is simply another way of being real. Perhaps the truth is simpler than any of these theories, or more complex than all of them combined. Perhaps the story of the Green Children is meant to remind us that the world is larger than we imagine, stranger than we assume, full of possibilities we haven't even begun to consider. In our modern world, where everything seems explainable, where mystery is often seen as a problem to be solved rather than a gift to be treasured, the story stands as a gentle reminder that some questions don't need answers, that some mysteries are more beautiful when left unsolved, more meaningful when allowed to remain mysterious, more powerful when they continue to challenge our assumptions about what is possible, what is real, what exists in the spaces between certainty and doubt. The Green Children of Woolpit, whether they were refugees or metaphors, visitors from other dimensions or products of medieval imagination, remind us that wonder is not the enemy of knowledge but its deepest companion. And perhaps that's enough. Perhaps the story doesn't need to be solved, doesn't need to be reduced to comfortable explanations or rational theories. Perhaps it's meant to exist as it has for nearly 900 years, as a question mark in the margin of history, as a reminder that reality is larger and stranger and more wonderful than we usually dare to believe, as a gentle invitation to keep our minds open to possibilities we haven't yet learned to see. So what are we left with, here in the quiet hours, as this strange and gentle story draws to a close, as we sit together in the peaceful darkness, listening to the echoes of a tale that has survived nearly 900 years, that has outlived kingdoms and empires, that has weathered the rise and fall of civilizations, yet remains as fresh and mysterious as the day two green children first stepped out of legend and into the harvest fields of medieval England. We have fragments, pieces of something that might have been, that perhaps still is, accounts written by careful men in an age when the impossible was still possible, when the world held spaces for wonder, for mystery, for the kind of magic that doesn't announce itself with trumpets and fanfare, but whispers itself into existence on ordinary afternoons, in the midst of ordinary tasks, in the hearts of ordinary people who suddenly find themselves face to face with the extraordinary. Two children, green as summer leaves, green as the heart of ancient forests, green as the first shoots of spring pushing through dark earth, appearing at the edge of a medieval village like visitors from a dream, carrying with them the memory of a world that existed, if it existed at all, in the spaces between the familiar and the impossible, between what we know and what we can only wonder about. A boy too gentle for this harsh world, too fragile for its demanding light and urgent rhythms, who faded like morning mist, like the last star before dawn, leaving behind only the memory of his quiet presence, his shy smile, his small hands that held flowers as if they were messages from home. His death was not just the end of a life, but the closing of a door, the severing of a connection to something beyond our understanding. A girl who learned to live between worlds, who carried the twilight with her even as she walked in our bright sun, who adapted and thrived and married and had children, but who never quite lost that otherworldly quality, that sense of existing partially elsewhere, of being a bridge between what is and what might be. Agnes, whose very name meant purity, holiness, but who carried within her the wildness of untamed possibilities. You can still visit Woolpit today, if you're ever in Suffolk, if you find yourself drawn to places where the impossible once touched the everyday. It's a quiet village, peaceful, settled in the way that only English villages can be, the kind of place where time moves slowly, where the past feels present, where the very air seems to hold memories of all the lives that have been lived there, all the stories that have unfolded in its gentle embrace. The fields remain, rolling green hills that stretch to the horizon, dotted with the same wildflowers that Agnes might have picked as a child, bordered by the same ancient hedgerows that have marked the boundaries of the known world for centuries. The landscape is softer now, more cultivated, but it still carries that quality of timeless peace, of connection to rhythms older than human memory, older than written history. The church still stands, its stones weathered but enduring, its bells still ringing the hours, marking the passage of time in a world that has learned to measure everything, to quantify everything, to explain everything, yet somehow cannot quite explain the persistence of mystery, the way certain stories continue to resonate long after their practical purpose has been served. St. Mary's Church, where Agnes was baptized, where she took her place in the Christian community, still welcomes visitors, still offers a space for contemplation, for the kind of quiet reflection that allows the soul to expand, to consider possibilities beyond the merely rational. The font where she was welcomed into the faith still stands, though the water that blessed her has long since evaporated, returned to the great cycle that connects all things. The Woolpits are long gone, filled in, built over, absorbed back into the landscape like secrets returning to the earth. But the name remains. Woolpit. Wolfpit. A place where traps once waited for creatures that no longer roam these gentle hills. And sometimes, the old-timers say, if you know where to look, you can still see the depressions in the earth, the shadows of those ancient holes, the places where the wild things once fell. But perhaps the real wolf pits are not the ones that were dug to catch animals. Perhaps they are the places where our ordinary world thins, where the boundary between the possible and the impossible becomes permeable, where children from other worlds might step through, carrying with them the scent of eternal twilight, the memory of bells that ring in harmonies our ears can barely comprehend, the promise that reality is larger and stranger than we usually dare to believe. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, when the light has that particular quality that speaks of endings and beginnings, when the shadows grow long and the air grows still, when the modern world briefly forgets to assert its dominance, people say the light changes in Woolpit, that it softens, takes on a glow that isn't quite from the sun, that seems to come from somewhere else, somewhere deeper, somewhere that remembers what it was like when the world was young and full of wonders. And sometimes, when the wind is right, when the modern world grows quiet enough to let the old sounds through, when the barriers between then and now become gossamer thin, they say you can hear them. The bells that Agnes remembered, the bells that rang in the deep places as she and her brother walked through darkness toward a world they didn't understand, toward a reality that would challenge everything they thought they knew about the nature of existence. Not church bells, not the familiar bronze voices that call people to prayer on Sunday mornings, but something else, something that rings with harmonies no earthly metal could produce. Bells made of crystal, perhaps, or of light itself, or of the kind of music that exists only in the spaces between worlds, between one kind of reality and another, between what we can measure and what we can only wonder about. They ring far, far underground, in the tunnels that may or may not exist, in the passages that connect what is to what might be, calling to those who have the ears to hear, to those who remember that the world is larger, stranger, more wonderful than we usually allow ourselves to believe, calling to the part of us that knows, deep down, that mystery is not the enemy of truth, but its most faithful companion. Maybe that's what the story of the Green Children is really about. Not about proving or disproving, not about finding explanations that satisfy our need for rational answers, but about preserving a sense of wonder, about keeping alive the possibility that somewhere, just beyond the edge of everything we think we know, there are other ways of being, other ways of existing, other kinds of light that illuminate truths we haven't yet learned to see. Agnes lived and died. Her green skin faded to normal. Her strange accent mellowed into the familiar rhythms of Suffolk speech, her memories of St. Martin's Land perhaps dimmed by the ordinary business of living in our bright, noisy, overwhelming world. But something of her remained, something that couldn't be explained away, something that continues to whisper in the spaces between certainty and doubt, between the known and the unknowable. The story has survived nearly 900 years, not because it's true in the way we usually understand truth, but because it's true in a deeper way, in the way that all the best mysteries are true. It reminds us that the world is not fully mapped, not completely understood, not entirely tamed by our explanations and theories, not reduced to the sum of what we can measure and quantify and control. It tells us that there are still places where anything might happen, still moments when the impossible might step out of legend and into the bright light of an ordinary day, still children who might appear at the edges of our familiar world, carrying with them the scent of other places, other times, other ways of being human, other possibilities that we haven't yet learned to imagine. And perhaps, in the end, that's enough. Perhaps the story of the Green Children isn't meant to be solved, but simply to be treasured, kept alive, passed down like a precious gift from one generation to the next. A reminder that mystery is not a problem to be eliminated, but a blessing to be preserved. A window into the deeper nature of a reality that is far more wonderful, far more complex, far more alive with possibilities than we usually dare to believe. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, you might find yourself thinking about twilight lands, about the sound of distant bells, about children who carry starlight in their eyes and the memory of impossible places in their hearts. These are good thoughts to fall asleep with. Gentle thoughts. Thoughts that open doors rather than closing them. Thoughts that invite wonder rather than demanding explanations. Let yourself imagine, just for a moment, what it would be like to step through one of those doors, to find yourself in a place where the light never quite fades, where the seasons exist in perfect balance, where the very air hums with possibilities we've forgotten how to see, where time moves differently, more gently, more in harmony with the rhythms of the heart than the demands of the clock. And then, let that imagining carry you into dreams, into the soft darkness where all stories become true, where green children still walk through twilight forests, where bells ring in crystal harmonies, where the boundaries between worlds are as thin as breath, as permeable as starlight, as real as the beating of your own heart. You're safe here, in this space between waking and sleeping, between the story and the silence that follows, between the known and the unknown. The green children have returned to their twilight land. Agnes has found her peace, and you can rest, knowing that somewhere, in the deep places, the bells are still ringing, still calling, always calling, to those who remember that the world is full of wonders. Still singing, always singing, to those who know that mystery is a gift, that questions can be more beautiful than answers, that sometimes, on quiet nights, when you listen carefully, you can hear the sound of other worlds, breathing gently, just beyond the edge of everything you thought you knew, carrying with them the promise that reality, our wonderful, impossible, mysterious reality, is far stranger and more magical than we usually dare to believe. Let sleep come now, soft and gentle, like twilight falling over ancient fields, like mist rising from morning meadows, like the whisper of wind through trees that have watched over Woolpit for centuries, carrying with them the memory of two children, green as summer, who stepped out of legend and into our hearts, reminding us that wonder, that mystery, that the impossible made manifest, is never very far away. The story is over, but the mystery remains, beautiful, unsolved, eternal, a gift that keeps giving, a question that doesn't need an answer, a gentle reminder that the world, our wonderful, impossible, mysterious world, is far stranger and more magical than we usually dare to believe, far more full of possibilities than we usually allow ourselves to see. Rest now, dream well, and remember that somewhere, in the spaces between sleeping and waking, between certainty and wonder, the green children are still walking, still exploring, still carrying with them the light of that eternal twilight, that blessed and a peaceful, impossible place, where all mysteries find their home, where all questions lead to deeper questions, where all stories become one story, the story of wonder itself. Sleep comes now, gentle as evening, soft as starlight, carrying you away on currents of wonder, to places where questions matter more than answers, where mystery is treasured more than certainty, where the sound of distant bells plays lullabies for all the dreamers who remember how to believe in the impossible, in the wonderful, in the green children who remind us, even now, even here, that magic, real magic, is never very far away. Good night.